This is Ruby Park. The girls who fought for Netaji's army. This is our next session, and Gayathri Ponvannan and Subhashini Ali in conversation with Adittya Nath Mubayi and Mudita Chauhan Mubayi about the INA, which is the Indian National Army. Gayathri Ponvannan is a network engineer and author of several fiction and non-fiction books for children. Her works have also appeared in several leading newspapers, magazines, and anthologies. She especially enjoys introducing children to the wonderful world of science, history, stories, and mysteries. Subhashini Ali is an Indian politician and a member of the Communist Party of India. She is a Marxist Party of India. She is a trade unionist and leader of all the Democratic Women's Association. She is currently a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of India, Marxist Party of India, okay, and was inducted to the Politburo of the party in 2015, becoming the second woman member after Brinda Karat. Aditya is a child, but we've just spoken about him, but I'm going to again introduce both of you. So Aditya would drive people nuts asking questions all the time. Today he does it for a living through his enterprise Quizcraft Global and has executed over 5,000 quiz shows across the world. Aditya has written quiz books titled India Unlimited, school textbooks titled Knowledge Quest, and Mathanama, an interactive book with stories about India, which we just heard about. Mudita manages Quizcraft Global, a knowledge enterprise that has executed over 5,000 quiz shows around the world. She loves to quiz young people, but she also loves language and all its possibilities. For 25 years, she has been immersed in the publishing world in her various roles. She has co-authored Mathanama with Aditya. Over to all of you. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. How are you all? Good? Great? Yes, great. Wonderful meeting you all. I am Gayathri Ponvannan. I am the author of this book we're discussing today. It's called The Vanguards of Azad Hind. So what this book is about and about the title and everything, we'll discuss in a bit. But first, I wanted to thank you all for coming to this session today. It's wonderful to see you all here. I'm looking forward to a great session, a great discussion with all of you and with our panelists here. So Ms. Subhashini Ali, ma'am, thank you so much for being here, agreeing to be a part of this session. Because it's such an honor sharing the stage with you. Apart from your own political achievements and your no, ma'am. Apart from that, I think you're the closest that many of us can get to the Indian National Army at this point of time. So Ms. Subhashini's parents, her mother, Captain Lakshmi Swaminathan Sagar, and her father, Colonel Prem Sagar, were both members of the INA. They were both super soldiers in Netaji's army. And they were both playing huge roles in the organization. So it's going to be a great learning experience for all of us, listening to Ms. Subhashini talk about her parents' time in the army and her own insights about this organization.
Can I just add to that?
Thank you.
I think what is important, which everybody seems to have left out, I think that we are talking a lot about the Rani of Jhansi regiment because of the young women who joined. तो हमारी जो माँ थी कैप्टन लक्ष्मी वो रानी ऑफ झांसी रेजिमेंट की हेड थी. तो ये जानना ज़रूरी है कि ये औरतों ने कोई 17 साल की थी, some were 16 years old, 17 years old, how they were inspired to join the Indian National Army and the Rani of Jhansi regiment. And I want you all to know that this was the first fighting regiment of women ever in world history. Please write that down. That was women of Indian origin living in Southeast Asia joined the Rani of Jhansi regiment, which was part of the Indian National Army led by Subhash Chandra Bose. और ये जो रानी ऑफ झांसी रेजिमेंट थी, ये पूरी दुनिया के इतिहास में पहली रेजिमेंट थी जिसमें औरतों को मिलिट्री ट्रेनिंग दे करके उनको युद्ध में भेजा गया. So this is something we should all be very, very proud of.
We are discussing this in great detail in the book, ma'am, in the session.
I think the book has a lot of investment into this aspect.
In this aspect of the first women regiment, infantry regiment. And Aditya and Mudita, thank you so much for being here and agreeing to host this session. They both are quiz masters. You've seen them in action. So we're having a couple of quizzes in this section as well, this session as well. So we'll be seeing more
escaping us.
So yeah, I think Mudita will carry on with the session.
Yeah, thank you. So as Subhashini ji said, you know, this is a connect. We have a living connect here with a history that we would otherwise have read about, maybe seen a documentary or two. There are very few women from that time who would be with us today. So, because they were so young at that time, of course, over the years. But I think what Gayatri has done through her book, and which historical fiction does so beautifully, is to bring alive, to let us step into a period that otherwise, we would, unless we were time travelers, not have opportunity to, experience. So the whole idea of bringing alive that time, that era, that energy, that, what was it that was motivating these young girls? Why would you leave everything? What was inspiring you? And through a young protagonist in this book, who we'll come to later, we travel through her ideas, through her experiences across the continent, and then we see some action. So I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but I would ask Gayatri to tell us a little bit about the book, and then we move on.
I think that's a very pertinent point about time traveling, because historical fiction is more like a time travel machine. Like, history gives you all the facts, but if it's historic fiction, you follow a character and you follow their emotions, and you get something like a 360-degree view of that era that you're talking about, right? So this book, that's what I've tried to do in this book. So we are going to travel back to a very eventful time in history and meet a lot of amazing women that not too many people were aware of, but should be aware of. So that's what we're trying to do in this book. So can we have the slide, please? So this book is called The Vanguards of Azad Hind. I'll just give you a brief introduction, a brief summary, so we'll know what we're talking about. So Vanguards of Azad Hind. What does Vanguards mean? Anyone knows? Vanguards is a leading regiment, the regiment that leads an army into war. So that's what Vanguard means. And Azad Hind, all of you will know, right? Yes? You're all from Kolkata, from Bengal. Definitely you'll know the Azad Hind. And even if you don't, you'd have figured it out from the book cover. Whom do you see there? Anyone that you can recognize in the book cover? Netaji is there, exactly. So the Azad Hind Fauj, or the Indian National Army, was the army organized by Netaji. No, ma'am, I'm coming to that. Yeah, organized by him. So we are coming to that in a bit. So organized by him, we'll come to that history bit in a while, but organized by him in order to fight against the British and free India from foreign rule. So that's what the Azad Hind Fauj was. And this book is about the Rani of Jhansi Regiment. Who were they? They were the leading army of this regiment. They were supposed to have led the army into war. So the Vanguards of Azad Hind are a very special unit called the Rani of Jhansi Regiment. And ma'am has already mentioned it, right? What is special about them? They were the first ever, one of the first ever at least, first ever all-women combat-ready military unit. So this unit was comprised of at least around 1,000 women, only women, all right? And many of them were teenagers, all of them were volunteers, and they all trained as proper soldiers. So they fought with the guns and rifles of the time, they trekked through the jungles, they drove trucks through the jungles, they did combat training, and they prepared to lead their army into war. Okay, so that is what this book is about, this very special all-women Rani of Jhansi Regiment. So in this book, we'll be following the fictional adventures of an imaginary character called Kayal. So our protagonist's name is Kayal. And she is going to join this Rani of Jhansi Regiment. And she's going to train with them. She's going to see war. And in the process, she's going to be meeting some historical figures associated with this army. So first of all, she's going to meet Netaji himself, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, the commander-in-chief of this Azad Hind Fauj. She's going to meet him. He plays a major role in the book. And more interestingly for our session today, she also meets the commanding officer of this Rani of Jhansi Regiment, the chief organizer, chief inspiration, Captain Lakshmi Swaminathan Sagal. Can we have the next slide, please? So that is Captain Lakshmi Swaminathan Sagal. She looks very cool, right? And she's better than that. She was a very strong and very inspirational woman. All right? And just imagine, this book is set 80 years ago, 1943. So back then, inspiring hundreds of women to join an army. Takes someone really special to do that, right? So by all accounts, Captain Lakshmi was a wonderful person, a very strong person. But I think Ms. Subhashini will tell us more.
Subhashini ji, we'd just like to take you back a few years and tell us about your memories with Captain Lakshmi Sehgal and your own childhood relationships at that time.
See, we have a short session. And I think talking about myself is very boring and not of any interest to anybody. I mean, I grew up, I had parents, and I had a wonderful childhood. That's not really important. But what is important, I think, is to think about these people and what they did. It was just completely amazing. I mean, if I think about my mother and if I think about my grandmother was a practically illiterate girl growing up in a village in Kerala. And at about 14, somebody who had known her father came to the house and said, well, you know, now I'm doing well. I was very poor. Your husband helped me to my great-grandmother. And I want to, you know, help your family. So a man always thinks that the greatest thing he can do is offer himself in marriage. So he said, if you have any daughter who's not married, I would like to marry. So my great-grandmother said, no, 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 there's only this girl. She's a tomboy. She's very young. But anyway, she came and started talking to this gentleman. And he was very taken because she was very, very lively and very, you know, precocious. बहुत बातें कर रही थी ये वो. So he got very interested. He said,
conditions as well.
He said that, well, will you marry me? So she said, looked at him and said, well, I don't mind, but I've got certain conditions. And I think every young girl should listen to this story. She said to him, I'll marry you if you agree to certain conditions. So what were those conditions? The first was, I don't want to live in a village, I want to live in a city. Number two, I want to be properly educated. I want to learn English from an English woman because I want to speak English properly and be properly educated. And the third condition is the most interesting. She said, nobody asks my brothers, where are you going, who are you going with, and when are you coming back? I don't want you to ever ask me, where are you going, who are you going with, and when are you coming back? And my grandfather, he later became my grandfather, agreed to all her conditions, but he was not like one of those people who कहते हैं कि I had my fingers crossed, you know. I'm not really going to do all those things. He actually really was committed to women's equality, which is very rare. And so he said, I agree to all your conditions. And he did agree to all the conditions. He carried them out. And when he was dying, my grandmother was only 30 years old. He made her promise that she would not shave her head. She would continue to wear colored saris. She would continue to be independent. And he said, I have left you enough money that you never have to ask your son for 5 rupees in your life. You are going to be independent. Just do what you want to do. And she did. She became a member of the Municipal Corporation of Chennai. She became an MLA. And she became a member of the Constituent Assembly.
He was one of the
only
people who
15
wrote it.
people, there were only 15 people who helped in framing the Constitution. And I'm proud to say she supported Dr. Ambedkar every minute of his fight for the Hindu Code Will. She was in the select committee. She fought for it. And she said, when people were opposing it, saying that our religion doesn't give equal rights to women, she said, well, then I don't want to be part of your religion. I want to go back to the Kerala system of Marumakatayam, matrilineal property relations. I don't want to be part of your religion. So she was a gutsy woman who deserved to have her conditions honored. And she was fortunate to marry someone who did observe them. So he treated, of course, his daughters and sons equally, and my mother became a doctor. But then we'll tell her story a little later. So it's more interesting, I think, to hear about these people. We were boring people who grew up going to school, getting all the privileges that come with a middle class life.
All your memories are there, and they're still relevant for all of us for this.
These are memories that you have to take memories out that you're interested in. Otherwise, many of my cousins don't know these stories. Except after I kind of written about them and said, oh, wow, really? Because otherwise you just thought of her as a grandmother or a mother or as an aunt, you know.
Yes.
Which is very...
And that time, 1943, which is when the book is set, it was a time of great turmoil. The Second World War was raging. People were fighting for what someone believed was freedom, someone believed was justice, someone believed was good versus what someone believed was evil. And those conflicts have always been there, but this was one of the few times that the entire world was a battlefield. But there were a lot of things that were happening at that time, and one of those, I'm going to ask you 3 questions now, just to set what is happening in the world around at the time when this book is set. First up, 1943 was the year that an amazing book for children was first published. This book was written by an exiled French aviator or pilot called Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And it is a book that begins in the most interesting way. And it is probably one, if not the best, children's book that I have read. and I think especially children should read it. Definitely anyone who wants to have children should read it so that you can understand children better. Or not have them. Yeah. Anyone who knows? Yes. The Little Prince is correct. Well done. That is Le Petit Prince or The Little Prince. Okay, so there were some amazing good things happening at that time. There were other things which is, let's set a little historical tone to it. On 26th August 1943, which later Viceroy and then Governor General of Independent India was named Supreme Commander of all the Allied forces in Southeast Asia. Which later Viceroy of India and then the first Governor General of Independent India. Yes, we have a hand sort of semi going up there. Yeah. Lord Louis Mountbatten is correct. Well done. Can we have a big round of applause? Lord Mountbatten was, in 1943, given charge of the entire battle theatre, it was called. I'm not too sure how great a military tactician he was, but he was member of the royalty, and always someone has to be put in charge of this there. But okay, and then narrowing it down a little, coming back to the Azad Hind, at which place in India, on 30th of December 1943, did Netaji raise a national flag of India and proclaim an independent Indian government, or the Arzi Hukumat-e Azad Hind? At which place did Netaji raise a national flag of independent India? Yes, ma'am.
Andaman?
Andamans, yeah, well, it is Port Blair, which is the biggest city there. Well done. So, I mean, all the answers done, dusted. Yeah. So, Shaheed and Swaraj are the names that they gave to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands at that point of time. And a currency was issued, a national anthem was made, stamps were made, printed, and it was, to all extents and purposes, a reasonable functioning government that was installed. Okay, let's get back to what is happening in the book.
So that was setting the timeline, because 1943 is where the action of the book happens. And the action of the book, very interestingly, it's quite transnational. It crosses borders, because there's this young girl who starts off from a town in the south of India, and how she moves to the east of India and then further beyond the borders, and how she experiences and how she grows really through that experience. So I'm going to ask Gayathri to just take us, you know, on this little journey with Kayal, right?
Yeah. So this book is based in, So, yeah, as Mudita had said, so this was in 1943. So book is based partly in India and partly in Burma. We know of it as Myanmar now, but back then it was Burma, all right? So we must remember these places in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Burma, they had all been long British colonies, just like how we in India were a British colony back then. So these places were also British colonies. But in 1942, 1943, Japan invaded and captured these places. They conquered these places. So during the time of our story, in 1943, Burma was part of the Japanese, I mean, they were under Japanese control. So that is one part of the setting. And importantly, this was to the place that Netaji came looking to form a fighting unit. So let's see why he might have come here, right? So first thing is, there was a large expatriate Indian community there. Just like how now we have Indians living in USA, UK, Australia, going there for work purposes. Back then, there were millions of Indians in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Burma, those kind of places. Thailand and all of Southeast Asian places. So why did they go there? There were lots of teak and rubber plantations, so they were working as plantation workers. Some of them were rich businessmen. Some of them were doctors. I think Mr. Vashni, will tell us more about it. So there was a huge Indian community there. So that is one point. Second point, they also formed, there was a small military unit there, comprising of ex-British Indian Army soldiers. So these were Indian soldiers who had fought for Britain in the World War, and they had been captured by the Japanese. So some of these soldiers said, okay, we're not going to fight for Britain. Instead, we're going to fight for an Indian state. And they formed an organization called the First INA, the First Indian National Army. So this unit was handed over to Netaji when he came there in 1943. He came to Singapore and this unit was handed over to him. And together with Japanese help, Netaji formed the Azad Hind government. Can we have the next slide, please? 43, when they formed the government and... Yeah, they formed the government and he started organizing. Yeah. So that is when Netaji formed the Azad Hind government, and alongside it, he started forming the Azad Hind Fauj, the Indian National Army. All right. So for this army, he called these expatriate Indians, all these plantation workers, all these businessmen. He called all of them and he said, let's form an army. Let's all become soldiers. We will march into India and liberate India from foreign rule. And he was so inspirational that thousands upon thousands of Indians joined his army and they made this a massive Azad Hind Fauj. And as an integral part of this army, Netaji said there should be a women's regiment. He said women should have an equally important role in an army. And so he said, I don't want women to be like Florence Nightingales. That is also a brave job, helping injured soldiers on the battlefield. But he said women should not be restricted only to that. Instead, I want them to be like Rani of Jhansi, lead the army into war and fight the enemy. So that was the idea behind this Rani of Jhansi regiment that was formed alongside the Azad Hind Fauj as one of the regiments of the army. So this is a setting of our story. The Azad Hind Fauj camp in Rangoon. Rangoon was the capital of Burma. They had two camps, one in Singapore, one in Burma. So our setting is the camp in Burma. That's where our story is set. So I've given a very brief and very broad explanation. So Ms. Subhashini, I think, will know much more in detail.
Yeah, there are many things to be told, but I'm not going to go into so many details. There's not enough time. But one or two things I think you should know. One is that my mother was the only member of the Rani of Jhansi regiment who had been born in India and had grown up in India. What is very, very interesting is more than 1,200 women ultimately joined the Rani of Jhansi regiment, and none of them had been in India. They had not seen India. Their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents had migrated to Southeast Asia and they had grown up there. And despite the fact that they had never seen India, they were also greatly inspired by a dream of an independent India, which was the land of their forefathers. So I think this is something very much that we have to remember, that the people who fought had never seen the country but were still inspired. The second thing is that who were there? You know, Netaji was very different from many other leaders in India. He was seriously committed to women's equality. And I don't really see that in too many other leaders, especially not of his generation. Because long before he reached Singapore, when he was still in the submarine, I hope you all know that he escaped from house arrest here in Kolkata, and he dressed as a Muslim gentleman and went to Peshawar. From Peshawar, he came to Germany, because we have to understand one context which has not been explained. We should not be ashamed of it. Germany and Japan were allied against England. And they are supposed to be the bad guys today, because those who win the war write the history. So they are the bad guys, and the Brits, who are really bad guys, they are now the good guys, okay? So he went to Germany. Why? Because like in Singapore, there were large numbers of Indian soldiers who had surrendered to Germany as part of the British Indian Army. And he decided to use them and form an army in Europe to fight against the British. His theory was, my enemy's enemy is my friend, because I have to fight for independence with whatever I can get from anywhere. He was very clear about that. He didn't like Hitler. He hated Nazism. He didn't like the Japanese invasion of China. He wrote openly about it. He told Hitler that you are racist, I cannot accept your racism, and all of that. He was a brave man, an honest man, but he also felt he needed their help to get Indian independence, and that's why he went there. Anyway, so he reaches Germany. From Germany, Hitler does the crazy thing, because, you know, most dictators are mad. Please remember that. We have some here also, you know. They're actually mad. So he decided to invade the Soviet Union, which was, of course, the end of Hitler after that. Anyway, so he was in no position to help Netaji in Germany. So Netaji was in touch with people in Japan. There's some other people you'll hear about, like Raj Bihari Bose, but anyway. And so he decided to come to Singapore to undertake what he was trying to do in Germany, but do it in Singapore. So he was sent on a submarine with somebody called Abid Hassan. It's a name you must remember, because Abid Hassan is the one who gave the INA slogan, which is our slogan. I'm asking you a quizzy question. What is that slogan? What is that slogan that we still use today? Sab log bolo. No, that is a speech,
We're
a
using it
slogan.
now as well.
What is the slogan when we greet each other? What do we say, even now? That's
Yes,
right.
Jai Hind.
Bolo sab log, kya hai slogan?
Jai Hind.
And who was the person who coined it? Abid Hassan. Because you are now told that people with a name like that, they can't be patriotic. So don't believe it. Don't believe what these mad people tell you, because they're basically mad, you know. So, anyway, Netaji came on the submarine with Abid Hassan, 3 months underwater at the time of the peak of the sea war, very dangerous. But what did he do during that journey? He wrote a lot. He also wrote a speech. What was that speech he wrote? He dictated a speech that he would make when the Rani of Jhansi regiment was established. Now here's a man, he doesn't yet have an army. He hasn't yet been made the head of the INA. He's already thinking, if I'm going to have an army of people fighting for independence, there's got to be a regiment of women, because Indian women, first of all, can fight, and they should be allowed to fight, because they need to fight many battles and they're never going to retreat. So he had planned this even before he reached Singapore. And he dictated his speech on the submarine to Abid Hassan that he was going to make at the time of the foundation of the Rani of Jhansi regiment. Okay, now can I speak for 5 more minutes? 2 more minutes, okay. So then he comes to Singapore, many things happen. He becomes the leader of the INA, and that's when he makes that speech, "Tum mujhe khoon do, main tumhe azadi dunga," which you spoke about, and all that. But after 2 days, he started talking to everybody, I am going to form this women's regiment. Now the Japanese were the worst kind of male chauvinists, possibly on planet Earth. Said, women's regiment. The only women who accompanied the Japanese army were... How old are you? Well, they were prostitutes. They were women that the Japanese soldiers used as prostitutes. That's the only work the Japanese army had for women. Said, you want to have an army of women? No, we can't have anything to do with it. We're not going to help you. He said, don't help me. My community will help me. Then he talked to the Indians over there who were part of the independence movement, and they also said, no, it's not possible. There are no women here. Where are we going to find women? Now, let me tell you, it's a very funny thing, but that answer is always given. Whenever there's a question of women either coming to parliament or anything, people say, where are the women? I mean, they were all born, obviously, without women. You know, people were born like Jesus Christ with, oh, well, even he was from a woman. I mean, Athena, maybe. Anyway, so women are only childbearers, cooks, etc., not leaders. He said, you give me one woman who can be a leader and organizer, and you see what we do. So they said, well, there is that lady who came to the airstrip to greet you. She's a doctor here. She's from a nationalist family. He knew my grandmother and all that. He said, yes, call her. So she was sent for at night. Now, my mother, she was really something else. She was a doctor there. She had come from Madras to escape from a marriage that she had had enough of. So she escaped from that marriage and came to Singapore, where she had some cousin and also a friend. And she started practicing medicine. And she's a very good doctor, and she's a very humane person, she was. So she had a huge practice. She had a booming practice there. So she comes at night to meet Netaji, and she's feeling very frustrated because she's been meeting the Indian Army officers who had joined the INA, and she's feeling that I'm left out, we have no role to play, etc., etc. So Netaji says to her, well, I want to start this women's regiment. So she jumps up and said, oh, that's just wonderful. And he said, will you? He said, yes. So he said, when can you start work? So she said, tomorrow. He said, what about your practice? He said, I'll put a lock on it. I'm not going to practice anymore. So not only the practice, but this poor friend that she had come to meet in Singapore, he was also abandoned. And you know, well, you can say for a bigger cause, a lot of people are abandoned. But anyway, I don't know. He continued to love her very much and be very fond of her. Anyway, yeah. So anyway, the next day she arrived and they started the job of an office and this and that. And then Netaji said something very significant. हम लोग हिंदी में कहते हैं गांठ बांध लो, मतलब make a knot and remember what I'm going to tell you. He said, don't worry about middle class people because they are opportunistic. Today they'll be with you, tomorrow they'll find something better to do, day after tomorrow they'll do something else. It's poor women, women from workers' families, women from the plantation workers' families. You have to address them. You have to go and meet them. Because once these women are committed to the idea of freedom, they are going to be fighting not only for India's freedom, but for their own freedom. Their freedom as women and their freedom as people who are born in poverty, freedom from poverty. And once they join, they will never step back. They will never compromise. And that is what happened. If you see the profile of the young women who came forward to join the INA, yes, there were a few from the richer families like Janaki Tevar and one or two others, but the vast majority, and they belong to South India mostly, and South Indian women are supposed to be physically very weak, which, I mean, you know, they carried rifles just like men. So they were the children of plantation workers, the poorest people in Southeast Asia. They were the children of small shopkeepers. They were the children of clerks, petty, petty employees of the government. These were the people who formed the bulk of the Rani of Jhansi regiment. And as I told you before, they were also people who had never seen India. So I think that what society does is very, very harmful to society, which is neglect the strength of women, neglect the potential of women. And when any society does that, like our society continues to do, it is actually giving up one of its biggest strengths just to protect something as horrible as patriarchy, which should not be protected in the first place. So anyway, these are the women who joined the Rani of Jhansi regiment. She's written a fictional account of a girl who was born in Madras. But the only girl who was born in Madras and joined the Rani of Jhansi regiment was my mother.
So
all the other girls who joined were born in Malaysia, in
exactly.
Singapore, in Burma, in Thailand. They had never seen India.
So
and
we
they
are having
belonged to
her
the
as a-
poorer classes,
In the-
working classes, and Netaji had great faith in them, and they certainly repaid his trust with interest. So I think that you all should really study this part of our history, which is not there in our history syllabus much, but there are books available. Her book is there. There are other books that have been written by Sagri, Chhabria, and other people.
And the
Try and-
autobiographies as well.
my own, yeah.
Well, you should mention.
So try and find out. अरे गूगल पे जाओ और रानी ऑफ झांसी रेजिमेंट डालो, बहुत कुछ मिलेगा, बहुत कुछ मिलेगा. और जाके देखो कि आप जैसी लड़कियां सुंदरबंस में जैसे गांव में लोग रहते हैं, बंगाल में जो गांव में रहते हैं, उसी तरह के गांव के रहने वाले साउथ ईस्ट एशिया की लड़कियां आगे आईं और बंदूक उठा करके उन्होंने आज़ादी की लड़ाई को लड़ा.
Wonderful, beautiful. I mean, I just want to keep listening to you because, you know, it's like really coming alive in front of me. But imagine the vision that these people have. Yes, and well, okay, yeah. I mean, I'm also sort of including Captain Lakshmi Sehgal in the sense that she tapped into this pulse. That really, you know, and the fact that it was answered, because I think there was a genuine, you know, understanding. And I love the way that this journey of these women, girls really, has emancipated them more than anything else. And that's when society is. So, yeah. So, well, yes, I mean,
But that was the exciting time.
yeah, I'm sure they carried the flame with them somehow, and it reflected in
I think
hopefully
all
their
of them, the one thing they all say, that was the most exciting time of their lives. Even someone like Captain Lakshmi, who had such an eventful life, still says that probably that was the most exciting time of her life, that her time with the army. So I
to be
think they all
part of
carried-
something so
Exactly.
intense, no? Well, so I mean, we have already spoken about Kayal, who is the protagonist, of course, and then we know that she is inspired by Uma Perima, who is partly based on Captain Lakshmi Sehgal, and then she meets Bose, Netaji. And could you tell us a little bit more about the characters on the way, her
Characters.
journey?
Yeah. We'll have the next slide, please. So this is our character. She's called Kayal, all right? She's 16 years old, and she's from Madras. We know of it as Chennai now. Back then it was Madras. Of course, this is historic fiction, so sometimes we'll have to take a little bit of creative license. So as ma'am said, not only Miss Captain Dr. Sagal had come there. Dr. Captain Lakshmi, she was then, right? So she had come there from Madras to Singapore and Malaysia. The others were all born and brought up there. But a little bit of creative license, so you'll all identify with the character. So this is Kayal. She's 16 years old, and she's a freedom fighter. She is fighting for freedom here in India. All right. So what I'll do is I'll read a bit of her introduction from the book, and you will see more about her. Okay. Okay. This chapter is called The Saboteur of Trains. It's set in 1943. I'll read the book out. Okay. And it's in Madras. So it's 4 o'clock in the evening, and the train carriage is packed. It's a proper mix of people in here, market traders, half-asleep students, and fully asleep office goers. And in just about a minute or so, all of them would be cursing me heartily. It's not a pleasant thought, really. The train rounds a corner. Half a dozen girls are already standing in position by the tracks, all in khadi, all waving placards. It's time. I close my eyes, I take a deep breath, and tug at the safety chain dangling right over my head. For a few seconds, nothing seems to happen. And then there's an almighty screech, followed by an almighty jerk. The train drags itself to a stop. The passengers, with all their bags and baskets, all fall against each other with a collective gasp. And into this confusion, I yell out as loudly as I can, "Karo ya maro, Inqilab Zindabad!" There's no response whatsoever. Honestly, the country is supposed to be fighting for independence from the British. Just about every leader has been under arrest, and Mahatma Gandhi has called for the people to do or die in the effort to free the country from foreign rule. But do any of the people here care? Absolutely not. The woman next to me is clutching her basket of vegetables, as though I'm a vegetable thief. The man across the aisle is commenting loudly on the stupidity of college students. Someone at the far end of the carriage asked to call for the police. No one bothers to ask why I stopped the train or why there's a khadi crowd outside the carriage waving leaflets and placards and screaming for all they're worth. "Quit India, Vande Mataram, one train down, one strike against the British." Ah well, at least I tried, and even this is a bit much for me. I mean, I don't know what my family would say should they realize the truth, that I, Kayal Vishwanath, am a freedom fighter. So that is our Kayal, all right? And what is she? She's a freedom fighter, but she's kept it a secret from her family. Because back then, even though a lot of people were fighting for freedom, there were some families that didn't want their women to go out and fight, the girls to go out and fight. Why go out? It might be dangerous. It might be unsafe. Why get into trouble with the authorities? These kind of questions were there. So Kayal's family was something similar to that, and they didn't want her to take part in the freedom struggle. So she's kept it a secret. And she's 16 years old. And back then at 16, what happens? You're asked to get married. 16 is considered a grand old age, and they ask you to get married. So her parents are arranging a marriage for her. She doesn't want to get married, so she's in a huge dilemma. She wants to study and become a doctor. She wants to take part in the freedom struggle, but she's not able to do any of this because she's going to get married. So she's in a big dilemma. And into this juncture comes her aunt, Uma Perima. Perima is aunt in Tamil. So her aunt comes to her help. Her aunt is a very strong and inspirational woman. And best of all, she is also a member of the Rani of Jhansi regiment. All right. So this is the character I had based on Captain Lakshmi, an older woman who comes to help this teenager. So Aunt Uma acts as a mentor. She helps Kayal convince her parents. She takes her from India to Burma. And then she joins the Rani of Jhansi regimental camp in Burma. So how they go from India to Burma when there's a war going on, how do they convince their parents, all that is there in the book. But basically, the idea is this aunt proved to be a mentor, someone strong and inspirational who helped the character through her journey. And I think that's the kind of role that Captain Lakshmi also played in the regiment. Because as ma'am said, there were a lot of plantation workers. Many of them were the poorer kind who didn't have too much rights. For plantation workers, especially women, there wasn't much right. They were not at all important in the scheme of things for most people. So she was the one who inspired these girls to join the army and gave them a purpose to which they held on all their lives. She could speak. That was a language at home, Tamil and Malayalam. And she just convinced their parents, because not everyone's going to send their children to war, the daughters to war especially, actual war. It was Dr. Lakshmi who went in and convinced his parents and inspired these girls to take up an army role and fight for India. Yeah, so that was our Kyle and our main characters there. Kyle also is partly inspired by Captain Lakshmi, I think, going in from Madras to
Right.
Burma. So
The
some
journey.
subconscious thing is there.
You know, Gayatri, so in the book also you talk about how they get into the camp and, you know, a little bit of what happens there. How they, and Miss Ali, you mentioned about, you know, the whole idea of the contrast of strength, what you're supposed to be and what you ultimately ended up, you know, doing. Can we give them a little glimpse about a camp life?
Yes.
Hota
we will,
kya tha?
yeah. What did they do? This was a proper military camp.
And
So
whether she then applied any of that to you.
we want to discuss that.
Did you have a
Was
regimental
home boot camp.
So this was a proper military camp, right? So they had all the activities that would happen in a regimental camp, in a military camp. So can we have the next slide, please, in the video? So can we play this? So these are the actual Rani of Jhansi regiment members in training, all right? So what are they doing here? First, they're having a drill. So that was one of the first activities they did. They drilled, and these are the girls of the regiment, the actual girls of the regiment. So there they are drilling. That's the first activity of the day. And then they have the flag hoisting. Okay, so, and they had these, they had these training, these armaments training. So you had the bayonets, the rifles, the Ben guns, the Sten guns, all the things that were there, all these weapons of the time, they learned to use. So you see them here using all those weapons for the training. And this is the flag raising. So you see the flag, it is very much like our Indian flag, same colors, but it has a spinning wheel in the center. So that was their governmental flag. So they're raising it here, and they're singing their national anthem. So this was very much similar to our current national anthem, Jana Gana Mana, but they sang it in a language called Hindustani. It's a mixture of Hindi and Urdu. So that's them singing the national anthem. We can't hear it now because this was shot 8 years ago. And then now they're getting ready. What can you see here? They're having a backpack, they're having a tin can, water bottles. What are they doing? They're going for trekking, because see, this army was supposed to come into India across the mountains between northeast India and Burma. Manipur, they almost came up there, yeah. So they're getting ready. So if you're going to be training with all your weapons and things and then going to collapse on the first hill, that's not going to be a done thing, right? So they trained to go and trek through the jungle, so they'll be prepared for their entry into India. So that's them there getting ready for the trek. So some of them trekked from Singapore to Burma, from Burma to the northern part of Burma, and they were all ready to march into India. So this is the Rani of Jhansi Regiment camp, and they're at their practice sessions here. So one more thing was they always inspired. They did cultural activities where they will produce plays. I think Captain Lakshmi produced a play. We have that in the book as well. So she produced a play, so we'll inspire others to join the army as well. They'll put up these performances so people can watch it and be inspired to join the army. So they sang songs, they did these cultural events. So it was a proper camp with lots of activities and a lot of events as well. So that is them in their training, all right?
Wow.
Yeah, I'll just...
Intense. Yes, ma'am.
I'll just add a few things to this. You see, they weren't just doing training. They actually, as she said, they went from Singapore. The camp was established then in Burma. And that was when the tide of the war had changed. The English were now the winning side, the British, and the Japanese were kind of retreating. Soon after this, Nagasaki and Hiroshima were bombed. But before this, they did go right up to almost the border of Manipur. And the plan was that at least 1 or 2 regiments would enter Imphal, and they did actually go into, they raised the flag. And the Rani of Jhansi regiment, it was Netaji's dream that that would be at the head of the army coming into India. There would not be any Japanese people with it, and Indians would welcome this army and would rise up against the British, and India would become free. That was his dream. But 2 things happened. One was, of course, I told you the tide of the war was shifting. But more than that, it's a really tragic thing. The monsoon came early. The monsoon came early in that year, and there was such torrential rain that it was really not possible for this regiment and the brigade to advance. And the British, apparently Winston Churchill himself realized that this was the most important battlefield. And he gave orders that more and more British reinforcements were to be sent to Imphal. So then it became a very unequal battle with just one or two regiments from the INA side and the entire might of the British army on the other side. The other thing that happened was that with the tide of the war shifting, the air force of Japan had to shift to protect Japan itself. So all the aircraft belonging to the Japanese Air Force left Southeast Asia and headed for Japan, and the British Air Force gained complete control over the skies, and they were just carpet bombing that area. I mean, if you read about the retreat, it is just so awful. On the one hand, they have no food, they're eating grass, but their spirits are very high. And when the Rani of Jhansi regiment was told to retreat, in fact, they wrote a letter to Netaji saying, we would rather die than retreat. Please let us go forward and fight, but we don't want to retreat. We don't want to surrender. It is quite a moving thing. And they had this dreadful retreat where they were, they had leeches, they got malaria, people were reduced to skeletons, the men and the women. They had, as I said, nothing to eat, and they were being bombed constantly. Hundreds and hundreds of them died on the way, and the stragglers were able to reach Netaji's camp in Burma, and that's when he decided to accompany the Rani of Jhansi regiment, what was left of it, back to safety, and he walked with them. That's also part of this story. But when you're just telling about the training, you have to understand what they were trained for. They were trained for a very unequal battle, fought in the worst physical conditions by people who were starving. But they never, never, never lost their spirit. It's quite inspiring. And maybe if the monsoon hadn't come early that year, history would have been different, and we would not have been told that we got freedom because somebody was, spinning. Actually, that's not true anyway, but that myth would also be exploded, and we would have realized that we had to really fight for our freedom, sacrifice for our freedom.
A lot of stories have been spun.
I think we'll be we are all in raptures. We're just listening, with this thing. But unfortunately, time has to be maintained. So we've got some questions which you can take.
Yeah, of course.
So 5 questions, and then we wrap up the session.
We'll do that, yeah.
Children, please ask your questions. You can ask anything. Yeah, you can just ask anything about the authors or about the
There is no
INA.
right question or wrong question. Yes. We have a girl.
My question is this, that when they when they trained, who told them or who decided what they were training about? Like first the fact that they did the drill, and then they hoisted the flag, and then they went trekking. Who decided this schedule?
The same kind of training that was given to the men in the army was given to them. So people from the male regiments were brought by Netaji to train the Ranis, and they were told that they were not to make any concession to the fact that they were women. Only one thing they had to be very careful about: there was to be no kind of misbehavior with any woman. That would just not be tolerated. So they were luckier than our women wrestlers are today, even though they're pretty tough, because the orders from the top were very clear. You're there to help them develop as soldiers. You're not there to try and get funny or make any kind of comments. You will just not be forgiven for that.
Good morning, ma'am. How far was this training and this fighting at Imphal of the INA and the Jhansi regiment influential in the Royal Naval Mutiny that followed in 1946?
See, these things are really not linked in that way. Because please remember that nobody in India really knew about the Indian National Army at that time. When they were fighting, when they were actually on the borders of India or whatever, very, very little was known. They used to broadcast, but the broadcasts were jammed. There was technology for jamming even then, like the technology that's being used today to jam certain videos. Anyway, so it was not very well known. What happened was that when the INA surrendered and many officers surrendered, the British brought many of these as their prisoners of war to the Red Fort in Delhi. And they selected 3 officers to go on trial for treason because they had broken their oath to their king, emperor. So 3 officers of the Indian National Army, one was a Muslim, General Shah Nawaz, one was a Hindu, though very atheistic one, Colonel Sehgal, my father, and one was a Sikh, Colonel Gurbaksh Singh Dhillon. So they were put on trial in the Red Fort, and suddenly the whole of India knew about the INA. They all knew about what these people had done. They all knew about what Netaji had tried to do. And actually the whole country really went completely delirious with excitement. And lakhs of people used to collect outside the Red Fort. So then these 3 people who were found guilty and were to be hanged, but the British, they circulated a message saying, if anything happens to either of them, there will not be a single English person left alive in this country. So the 3 of them who were to be hanged were let off with an honorable discharge. And actually it was the news of this trial and the news of brother soldiers fighting against the British that created a lot of discontent within the British Army and also among the naval recruits. The naval recruits got a lot of inspiration from this trial after they heard about the way in which Indian army soldiers had revolted against British Raj, and that's why they also revolted. And they had 3 flags. They tried their best to avoid the partition of India. Those naval recruits put up 3 flags on their ships. One was the Congress flag, one was the Muslim League flag, and one was the red flag. And they had these 3 flags and they said, please don't divide India. We will fight with you. We'll help you drive the British out, but don't divide the country.
So in a way, actually, by trying to make an example out of the Indian National Army soldiers or officers, the British created the whole story and spread the narrative much better than anyone else could have. The Brits were very good at that. Yeah.
But it was an amazing time. Amazing time. You know, there was no TV and all that. But lakhs of people used to go from all the neighboring villages in bullock carts, traveling all night.
Without WhatsApp.
Without anything.
Yeah.
And they would collect there and stand there the whole day outside the Red Fort. And then they would be told at 5 o'clock, no decision today, the trial will continue tomorrow. They didn't even know what was going on. But they all used to come. And it's very interesting. I met many of the people who used to go there. That's another story which I'll tell you some other time.
Do we have more questions?
Yes, we have a girl here. We have lots of hands
Come on,
now.
any one of here, right in front.
Before, why did they say that just men can fight in the army and not women?
I think it was the men that said that, right? Why did only men fight in the...
Why did they say that men only
Don't
could
you
fight?
see today that men are still allowed to do many things that women are not allowed to do? Does your mother ask you? Be careful. Don't talk to strangers. Come back soon. If you had a brother, she wouldn't be telling him that. So that's the difference. Women have always been treated as the weaker sex because it suits many people to do that, but they aren't actually.
You're all very strong, yeah.
We'll take one last question right at the back.
Right at the back. There's a boy.
Yeah.
So far, it's been the boys who've been raising hands, but I think they want to know also.
Good morning, ma'am. I'm not really sure whether it's morning or afternoon now, but okay. Ma'am, you mentioned that had the siege of Imphal really gone through, history might have been different, and we wouldn't have been told that we received freedom because of a man spinning the charkha. So, I mean, since that was, I mean, clearly a reference to Gandhiji, ma'am, how would you categorize Gandhiji's role in the freedom struggle? That is one thing that I would
No,
like
that's
to
a very
ask.
good question, and I think that Gandhiji's role has been spoken about a lot, and there's no denying that he was able to inspire vast masses of Indians to come into the freedom struggle. There's no doubt about that. He made it into a mass movement from something that had just been, confined to a very small strata of Indian society. So he made it a mass struggle. My point is not that the charkha didn't contribute. My point is that it was not only the charkha that got us independence. That was it. And I want to tell you that all this talk now, that they all disliked each other, they had differences, but they had great, immense regard for each other. And Netaji named his regiments the Gandhi regiment, which was a regiment fighting, against Gandhiji's ahimsa. So he had a Gandhi regiment, a Nehru regiment, and an Azad after Maulana Azad regiment. So that was the kind of regard they all had for each other. And in his first speech from the Red Fort, Jawaharlal Nehru sort of became very emotional and went away from his text and said that today someone who should have been here is not here, and that was Subhash Chandra Bose. This was his place to be here today. Right. So I think these were people who were big. They had big hearts, they had big minds, they had minds. Many people,
and they use those minds.
And small people have small minds.
Small minds, yeah.
They may be big to look at, but
So I think
they
we
have
can
small
close
minds.
the session.
Yeah.
I just like to...
Okay.
Okay, can I...
Can I tell you one story? A true one. Okay. This is a very important story for you to know, especially today. You see, Netaji tried his best to get as much funding for his army and for his government from the Indians. Oh, please let them wait for 1 minute, ma'am. 1 minute, 1 minute. My watch says it's not yet time. And I'm the boss here right now. Okay. So, a group of people who belong to a very rich community in Southeast Asia from Tamil Nadu called Chettiars, they came to Netaji and said, we are having our Dasera festival in our temple, and we would like you to come and talk to the people there, and we will give you a huge donation for the army and all that. So he said, I will not step into your temple and don't come and see me again. So they were shocked. They said, why? He said, because you don't allow people of lower castes and Dalits to enter your temple. You do not allow non-Hindus to enter your temple. So I will not come anywhere near your temple and you don't come to see me again. So they went back quite shocked. And after 2 or 3 days, they came back again. And they said, we've had a meeting and we've changed our rules. Nobody will now be stopped from entering the temple. Please come. So then he went there with his officers, 2 of whom were Muslims. And they went there and they all entered together. They were all respectfully welcomed. They were given tikas. Then they went inside and they did namaskar to the deity and they came out. And the moment they came out, Netaji removed his tika. And he said, this tika doesn't go with this uniform. When I'm in uniform, I'm an Indian. I don't have a religion. No religious symbols should be associated with people in public life. I think that's something we all should learn from. Yes? Thank you all.
Absolutely. I just want to say one line because Subhashini ji was talking about the respect that politicians earlier had for each other. And they were not afraid to express that respect for each other. They didn't give each other, these silly nicknames and derogatory terms. So Netaji said about Gandhi ji in a speech in Bangkok in 1943, no single man could have achieved more in one single lifetime under similar circumstances. That is the kind of respect that he had for Gandhiji, despite all the story that is told about how Gandhiji didn't like him and pushed him out. So whatever it was, they respected each other. They may not always agree with each other, but that is the point. You may not always sync with your neighbor, but always respect them.
And don't forget his flag. He had 2 flags. One was the government and one was the INA flag. The INA flag was also the tricolor with a springing tiger in the middle. And what was that springing tiger? That was the symbol of Tipu Sultan, one of the great freedom fighters of our country.
You just preempted all our questions.
3 questions I had, all of them gone.
Thank you for a
That's
lovely,
okay.
lovely session.
It's wonderful.
It was just wonderful. I think everybody just been listening to all of you. And Gayathri, thank you for writing this beautiful book. The books are on sale at the Mohar Kunj, just right outside the gate. You can go there. The authors are going there to sign the books. And Suhashini ma'am, thank you so much. Once you're done, you can come back to the author's launch. Okay? Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And at 12:30, we have a session at